The year is 476 AD. You're a Roman citizen in the city that used to run the world. The aqueducts still flow. The empire doesn't. The roads still reach everywhere. The forums still echo. But the people walking them look like they're waiting for bad news they already know. Your shop opens late because deliveries don't show up. Not from storms, not from war. From paperwork, bribes, and empty wallets. The soldiers at the gate aren't Roman-born anymore. They're allies. They're paid in promises. They look at you like a receipt. You keep hearing the barbarians did this. Convenient story. Barbarians didn't mint the coins, set the taxes, or write the budgets. Rome didn't get murdered in an alley. It bled out in public, slowly, with senators arguing about tradition while the math screamed. Picture the empire like a giant machine. It ran on taxes, trade, and trust. Break anyone, and it rattles. Break all three, and it stops. Rome's collapse wasn't one dramatic day. It was a pile of rational decisions that felt fine in the moment and fatal in hindsight. I had to read this part 3 times. They kept the Roman aesthetic while hollowing out the Roman economy underneath it. By the time the last emperor in the West gets deposed, the empire is basically a brand name slapped on a broken supply chain. The popular version is simple. Bad emperors, invading tribes, tragic ending. The economic version is uglier because it's repeatable. Because if you can collapse while your monuments still stand, you can collapse while your stock market still looks fine. So we're doing an autopsy, not a myth. 6 wounds, each one bleeding something essential. Money, manpower, food, borders, taxpayers, trust. Spoiler alert, it wasn't an accident. It was a system that kept choosing today's comfort over tomorrow's survival. Along the way, you'll meet an emperor who tried price controls, a narcissist who treated the treasury like a casino, and a farmer with no exit. And yes, we're going to talk about barbarians, just not as the main character, more like the cleanup crew. First wound, the currency debasement spiral. Rome doesn't run out of coins, it runs out of honesty inside the coins. Imagine you're a merchant in 200 AD. A denarius feels solid. People trust it. 2 centuries later, it's basically cosplay metal. Over about 200 years, the silver content drops from something like 95% to around 5%. Same stamp, different reality. That's not inflation is rising. That's the state quietly swapping your paycheck for a cheaper prop and daring you to notice. At first, it feels clever. You mint more coins. You pay more soldiers. You fund more projects. Everyone claps. Then prices move, because sellers aren't stupid. They weigh the coin. They test it. They adjust. Suddenly bread costs more, but really money buys less. Here's where it gets dark. Trust is an economic asset. Once people stop trusting currency, every transaction becomes an argument. Trade slows because nobody wants to be the person holding the fake coin at the end of the day. Markets don't die loudly. They hesitate. Then the government responds like governments do. Deny, decree, punish. As if you can outlaw arithmetic with enough angry paperwork. Enter Diocletian, late 3rd century. Big brain energy. He tries to brute force the economy back into obedience. He issues price controls. Maximum prices for goods. Maximum wages. A giant list telling reality what it's allowed to be. And reality responds by doing what it always does. Goods vanish. Sellers hide inventory. Black markets bloom like mold. You cannot make this stuff up. The state debases money, then criminalizes the prices that debasement creates. So officials start collecting taxes in kind. Not coins, because coins are embarrassing now. They want wheat, oil, livestock, labor. Congratulations, you've rebuilt a barter economy inside a supposedly advanced empire. That's not modernization, that's regression with paperwork. Now imagine you're that farmer. You don't just pay taxes, You deliver physical grain to a state warehouse, like you're feeding a machine. That warehouse system is expensive to run. It needs guards, clerks, transport, storage. The economy isn't producing more. It's just handling more. Meanwhile, soldiers still need to be paid. Bureaucrats still need salaries. The empire's costs don't shrink with trust, so they debase again. They decree again. They punish again. Step 1 becomes Step 2 becomes Step 1, but louder. If you're wondering why this matters, remember, currency isn't metal. It's a social contract. Rome violated it repeatedly. When money becomes suspicious, investing becomes risky. When investing dies, productivity stalls. When productivity stalls, the tax base withers. And that tax base is the next wound. Because Rome had a spending problem the size of a continent. Second wound, the military-industrial drain. Rome's army wasn't just big. It was the entire budget with a helmet on. By the late Empire, some estimates put military spending around 70% of the imperial budget. Let that sink in. That's not strong defense. That's your government existing primarily to pay men with swords to keep the lights on. Now meet Marcus, no relation to the channel name, just a tired legionary on the Rhine who hasn't been paid properly in months. His pay arrives late, in coins nobody trusts, and half of it is deductions. Equipment, food, fees. The empire invoices its own soldiers. So Marcus does what soldiers do when the state can't pay. He takes payment from the locals, not always politely. That turns the army from protector into predator, which is amazing because Rome needs these locals to stay productive and taxable. Here's the kicker. The army is supposed to secure trade, but an underpaid army makes trade feel like extortion with uniforms. The state reacts by recruiting more federates, allied barbarian groups who fight for land, status, and vague promises. That works short term, less immediate cash, more bodies. But you've just outsourced your monopoly on violence to contractors. Contractors who have their own leaders, their own loyalties, and their own exit options. Rome is basically building a franchised army. To keep them loyal, the state offers land grants and privileges, which reduces taxable land, which makes the budget worse. Do the math. And the more the budget strains, the more the state squeezes the productive classes, which makes production drop, which shrinks revenue again. You can feel the trap forming. Spend to defend the empire. Tax harder to fund defense. Destroy the economy that funds defense. Repeat. By the time you're in the 5th century, the Roman army in the West is a patchwork of units, rivals, and mercenaries. So when a crisis hits, the response isn't unified. It's negotiated. Rome isn't commanding an empire. It's haggling for survival. Third wound, the bread and circuses trap. Social stability bought with subsidies until the bill arrives and nobody can pay it. Rome had a genius political invention. Keep the urban masses fed and entertained, and they won't riot while you mismanage everything else. Free grain distributions for citizens. Public games. Spectacle as policy. It works for a while, like painkillers work. Now meet Lucia, a Roman mother in the city. She doesn't care about monetary theory. She cares whether her kids eat this week. The grain dole keeps her alive, but it also disconnects survival from local production. The city becomes dependent on imperial logistics. Those logistics depend on secure sea lanes, functioning ports, predictable taxes, and governors who don't steal the wheat. When any link weakens, the system doesn't gently adjust. It snaps. People don't downshift from bread. They riot. So politicians keep promising more. More grain, more games, more relief. Because cutting benefits is political suicide with torches. And here's the absurd detail. The empire is taxing farmers harder to fund free food, which makes farming less profitable. Farmers abandon marginal land. Estates consolidate. Smallholders vanish. The rural base that grows food gets thinner. Meanwhile, the city crowds grow. Not because things are great, because the countryside is worse. and at least the city has grain. That's not prosperity. That's migration driven by desperation into a system already straining. Commodus shows up like a walking cautionary tale, a ruler who treats the treasury like a personal entertainment budget. He's famous for games, vanity, and spectacle. The empire's finances are complicated, but his vibe is simple. Spend for applause. You cannot make this stuff up. The leadership class is basically doing influencer economics while the currency rots. Bread and circuses aren't the cause by themselves. They're the symptom of a political culture that can't say no to the crowd. When you teach a population that the state will always provide, you also teach them to panic when the state can't. And Rome eventually can't, which forces harsher extraction from the provinces, which makes provinces resentful, which weakens loyalty. Fourth wound, border collapse, economics. Not the dramatic battle scenes, the slow realization you can't afford the wall anymore. Rome's borders weren't just lines on a map. They were economic membranes, controlling trade, taxes, security, and movement. A functioning border means predictable commerce. Merchants travel, taxes flow, farms operate. The empire feels like one system. Now imagine you're a trader near the Danube. You used to have routes, guards, schedules. Now it's checkpoints run by whoever showed up. The state posts fewer troops because budgets are tight. Those troops are unreliable because pay is weak. Security becomes a local problem. Local problems get local solutions. Private militias, strongmen, deals with raiders. Rome's monopoly fades into a marketplace. Once borders leak, migration increases. Some are refugees. Some are opportunists. Some are armed groups looking for land and leverage. Rome tries treaties, settle them, recruit them, assimilate them. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it imports a power block. But wait, it gets worse. Every new settlement deal is also a message. Rome negotiates because it can't enforce. That changes incentives. More groups arrive, not because Rome is generous, but because Rome is vulnerable and still rich enough to loot. Meanwhile, provincial tax revenues decline because trade declines. And trade declines because borders decline. It's a feedback loop. Also, borders aren't free. Forts need repair. Roads need maintenance. Ships need patrols. Those costs don't go down politely. So the state squeezes again, which pushes more people into informal economies, which makes taxation harder, which cuts resources further. When the empire can't secure movement, it can't integrate markets. And without integrated markets, you don't have an empire. You have regions. Regions with different currencies, different power centers, different militias. Rome becomes a flag over a fractured economy. This is when the barbarians stop being outsiders and start being a political factor inside the system. Contractors, settlers, kings. The famous sacks and coups are late-stage symptoms. The real event is earlier. Rome losing the capacity to pay for order. Fifth wound, tax flight and the vanishing taxpayers. The empire doesn't lose land first. It loses the people who can fund the state. Now meet Gaius, a mid-level landowner in Italy. Not a senator, just wealthy enough to be noticed by the tax collectors. He sees the trend: debased coin, rising levies, arbitrary assessments, officials who sell exemptions like a menu. So he does what rational people do under predatory taxation. He hides assets. He moves wealth. He seeks protection from powerful patrons. Sometimes that means becoming dependent on a bigger estate. Sometimes it means donating property to the church or a noble for legal shielding. Sometimes it means leaving town. The empire calls it disloyal. Gaius calls it survival. The tax system gets more aggressive as the base shrinks, which accelerates flight. The state is chasing a shrinking pile with sharper knives. Here's the kicker. The people least able to flee are the small farmers and laborers. So the burden concentrates on the immobile. That pushes them into debt. Debt pushes them into dependence. Dependence turns free citizens into quasi-serfs tied to land. The empire responds by freezing people in place. Laws binding workers to jobs, peasants to farms, sons to fathers' occupations. That's not stability. That's an admission the economy is failing. So you're trying to legislate productivity through captivity. Think about that for a second. When you need laws to stop people from leaving their jobs, your system is basically leaking human capital. This also kills innovation. If your future is legally assigned, why invest in skills? Why improve output? Why take risks? Tax collectors become hated. Corruption blooms because discretion is power. Governors skim. Local elites bargain. The center gets scraps, so the state demands more. Provinces resent more. Compliance drops. Enforcement costs rise. The empire becomes expensive to administer. At some point, a province asks a brutal question. Why pay Rome for services Rome no longer provides? If the roads are unsafe, the border is porous, and the currency is fake, taxes start feeling like tribute to a fading myth. That's how you lose an empire without losing a battle. You lose the belief that the empire is worth funding. Midway check, we're not even done, and Rome has already broken its money, turned its army into a burden, and made food supply political theater. If you're feeling smug, don't. These aren't ancient quirks. They're incentives and arithmetic, which means they travel across centuries. So here's a question. When your government's costs rise faster than your productive base, what do? Reform or print and pray? Most choose print and pray, because reform hurts now and printing hurts later, and later is always someone else's problem. Rome chose later until later arrived with a bill big enough to knock over the West. Sixth wound, the final inflation and trust collapse. This is where the economy stops being a system and becomes survival. By late antiquity, money isn't just debased, it's unstable. Prices vary wildly by region, by week, by whoever controls a road. Soldiers demand payment in goods. Landowners store grain instead of currency. Taxes get collected in kind because money is a joke. Once you're in that world, specialization collapses. Craftsmen can't rely on distant buyers. Merchants can't price long routes. So production becomes local. Local becomes smaller. Smaller becomes poorer. The empire's grand division of labor shrinks. Rome's population story shows the consequence. The city of Rome itself falls from around 1 million to something like 50,000 within about 50 years. That isn't urban decline. That's a metropolis turning into a haunted museum with weeds between marble columns. Imagine walking past the Colosseum and hearing nothing. No vendors, no crowds, no commerce. Just stone and wind. And yes, violence matters. Raids, sacks, instability. But the reason violence lands is because the economic cushion is gone. A rich, functional system can absorb shocks. A hollow system breaks from a hard look. When the Western imperial title gets removed, it's almost anticlimactic. The structure was already gone. The label just caught up. The Eastern Empire survives longer because it holds richer provinces, stronger tax systems, better logistics. Same disease, better immune system. If you want the clean takeaway, Rome didn't collapse because it stopped being Roman. It collapsed because it stopped being solvent and coherent. Currency trust dies. Trade dies. Trade dies. Taxes die. Taxes die. Defense dies. Defense dies. Borders die. Borders die. Everything fragments. Do the math, and you realize the barbarians didn't need to conquer a healthy empire. They just had to show up when it couldn't pay. Now, two futures, because even Rome had choices earlier, before the trap tightened. Future A is the painful fix. Stable currency, honest taxation, disciplined spending, fewer games, fewer freebies, more production, politically miserable, economically survivable. Future B is the comfortable slide. Debase a little more. Spend a little more. Promise a little louder. Keep the vibes. Lose the base. Rome picked Future B over and over because Future A requires leaders willing to be hated today, to be praised never. And that's the darkest part. Collapse isn't usually a villain's plan. It's a democracy of bad incentives and short-time horizons. If it can happen to them, it can happen to anyone, especially if your system relies on trust you haven't earned recently. Rome's monuments survived the fall. People love that detail. It's romantic. It also hides the lesson. You can keep the architecture and lose the economy. You can keep the rituals and lose the capacity. You can keep the flag and lose the base. So when someone tells you we're fine, look around. Remember Rome in 476. The aqueducts still worked. The empire didn't. The math doesn't care about our feelings. If this autopsy made you uncomfortable, good. That means you're paying attention, not just enjoying the marble. Subscribe if you want more ruins explained.